biggest driver is this notion of intent to return, right? And what does intent to return mean? That means if you had an amazing experience, you're going to tell people about it, but you're going to come back. And when you come back to my restaurant or my retail store, my park or resort, when you come back, that means I have to market less to people who have never come, right? So ideally, I would say, I'd like to spend nothing on marketing. I'd like you to be my marketing vehicle.
Welcome to the Attraction Pros podcast, where we discuss the latest trends and challenges facing the attractions industry today.
We chat with some of the top leaders in the field and provide resources that will help develop your career in this great industry.
I am Josh Liebman. I am obsessed with the guest experience and helping attractions make that their top priority for success.
And I'm Matt Heller. I am passionate about organizational effectiveness, leadership development, and employee engagement.
Now sit upright, hold on tight, and get ready for the Attraction Pros podcast. Hey, Matt, how's it going?
Well, it's been a while, but I would say it's fantastic. How are you?
I'm good. Has it been a while?
Well, I think since we recorded our last episode,
I think so, yeah.
It's been at least a couple days.
That's true. That's true. That's too long. That's way too long.
It's a long time. It's a long time.
Matt, over the years that you have been visiting theme parks, attractions, leisure venues of all types, how much do you think you have spent, not just on admission, not just on food and beverage, how much do you think you have spent on really commemorating those experiences?
Ooh, so I don't know. As you can see again from my office, a lot of this stuff just came from parks that I worked at, the memorabilia that way. But in terms of like buying souvenirs and things like that, I wouldn't be able to put a dollar figure on it. I can tell you what I've purchased the most of.
What's that?
Mugs. Mugs.
Tea mugs.
Yes, exactly.
Not coffee mugs.
Not coffee mugs, but tea mugs. Absolutely purchased most of those. But even recently, I found that the way that I commemorate my experience is more through pictures than it is through souvenirs, unless I find something that is really, really cool that I know, like I'm going to wear that t-shirt or, going to use that keychain or whatever it is. But if it's going to be a souvenir, it's probably going to be a mug.
Yeah. And you brought up a good point there, because every single consumer or every single guest that comes into a theme park, an amusement park, a zoo, museum, has a different style of the way that they commemorate their experience. It might be with a photo, which might mean that you probably purchase more ride photos maybe than the average guest. That could be a very distinct possibility. And there are those who are more likely, because of how big of a fan they are and how connected they are with the brand, to purchase maybe a very premium item or a limited edition item that costs substantially more than maybe the traditional mug or keychain or something like that. And that's what makes retail really unique.
Are you one of those people that would purchase something that would be in the upper echelon of the value proposition?
I think that the answer is probably yes, but I also am pretty good at grounding myself too, and kind of like pulling my balloon back to earth. So a couple of months ago when I visited Cedar Point, and the park is celebrating its 150th anniversary, and oh man, did they do a very good job of creating merchandise that tailored to people who have a strong connection with the park and its heritage. And not everyone is going to buy that $2,000 exact replica of the Millennium Force seat. For me, yes, I would love to have that, but at the same time, that wasn't going to be something that I was going to drive home with. But I did end up getting, let's see if I can pull it out quickly. I did get a pennant, and this will probably end up on the wall back here, sometime. So for those who are watching this on the video, this is what I walked away with. It was something a little more cost effective, but also was something that I was able to commemorate my experience and also my connection with that park and its history. But I think that ties in really nicely with who our guest is today and the conversation that we're about to have with Kenny Funk, who is just an all-around really interesting, really inspirational guest that we have on the podcast today.
So what is really cool about Kenny is he's got this hypersensitivity to retail. And I'll be honest, I'm an operations guy. You're an operations guy. That's kind of how we grew up in the industry. And in that time, I didn't give retail a whole lot of thought. But to hear Kenny talk about it and the way that an organization can really maximize their opportunities to provide souvenirs that people can take home with them, the tangible opportunity to extend the experience, there really should be a lot of thought that goes into it. And it makes me thankful that there are people like Kenny who are dedicated to merchandise and souvenirs and, all those type of things that can, again, help extend the experience that people have when they go to any kind of hospitality place, for lack of a better word.
When talking about that tangible component of it, that you mentioned that you and I are both operations guys, what it does remind me of is when I took a detour out of operations into retail and specifically photo retail. Yep. When I left Universal Orlando to go open Legoland Florida, overseeing all souvenir retail. I remember sitting in my job interview and was asked, why do I want to leave operations? I was working in guest services at the time. I had been working in attractions and come into retail. And I remember saying something like, I love operations so much. And I love, rides, and I love being able to deliver a phenomenal experience. But now I've got the opportunity to really commemorate that and take something that I've always been doing from an intangible standpoint. And now here it is. Here is you on the ride. Here is you on the park and in the park. And it's very, very true of really all retail, that it is that tangible reminder and also that gratuity that guests leave after having a phenomenal experience. And that's something that we're going to dive in with Kenny. So Kenny oversaw retail for Walt Disney World for 21 years, from 1996 to 2017, retired briefly, and then worked with Great Wolf Lodge for another 4 years there, and recently retired again. And now we have the opportunity to just have this amazing, wide-ranging, but also at times very focused conversation. We talk about retail, we talk about leadership, as two, I would say, distinct entities here, and his philosophies on both are just very powerful.
Yeah, I would say let's get to it.
Let's get to it. Here is Kenny Funk.
Kenny Funk, welcome to the Attraction Pros podcast. How you doing today, Kenny?
Man, I'm doing great. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So great to see you. So Kenny, can you tell us and our listeners a little bit about your time in the industry?
Sure. Well, in the theme parks and resorts industry, I started my career in 1996. I'm a little bit older than that, but in this industry, 1996, I started with the Walt Disney Company. Spent about 21 years there. Ran global retail for Disney, strategy, planning, product development, all of those things for 21 years. Left in 2017 from that role, thinking I could retire, and had a little bit of brain atrophy, so I needed to go figure out something else to do. So Great Wolf Resorts called, growing business. We had 14 resorts at the time. We're growing pretty quickly to 19. So I spent 3 years with them, left about, a little over a month ago. And now I'm kind of retirement 2.0. But, not long thereafter, I got a call from a group called the Magic Makers Group, which is 25 former Disney executives with about 500 years worth of Disney tenure combined across a variety of disciplines within kind of theme park and resort and other business management. So leadership development, team engagement, consumer insight, data strategy, analytics, retail design and development, visual merchandising, communications, alliance development, blah, blah, so on and so forth, right? But I really I'm proud to be aligned with this group. I have worked with a bunch of these people over the course of my Disney career, and to a person, every one of them is as good or better than anyone in the industry in their field of expertise. So really proud to kind of hang my shingle with those folks. I'm an independent contractor with them, and we've got a number of different projects working right now, but exciting to be part of that group. So that's kind of the career arc for me and what I'm doing these days.
Yeah, I think the statement of 500 years of combined Disney experience, that's pretty cool. Because if you think of Disney itself, Mickey Mouse, 1928, I believe. So that's right. Definitely a lot of experience and expertise that, of course, adds up to be way longer than the life of the company thus far.
You nailed it. I mean, you get a prize for knowing what year Mickey was born.
Hey, I know my I know the stuff I know. At least I do my best. Well, these days I've been watching a lot of Mickey Mouse Clubhouse on Disney Plus, but not for me, but for the little one at least. Trying to reduce the screen time, try to control it a little, but occasionally I gotta throw it on. With your 21 years with Disney overseeing retail, I've got to imagine that retail in 1996 probably looked a little bit different than it did in 2017. Can you talk about maybe what that accelerated evolution may have looked like in terms of the importance of retail and the way that retail was delivered in the theme park experience?
Yeah, so retail has stayed the same in some respects, but then in others, as you might imagine, has materially changed of late. You think of the pandemic's impact on retail more specifically. So maybe a few answers to the question. So I'd say retail has changed in the sense that, or hasn't changed, I should say, in the sense that effectively what's sold in the retail shops hasn't changed much over the course of time, right? It's basic souvenir type stuff. It's keychains, it's hats, it's t-shirts, it's, things like that. And every theme park you go into around the world, you're going to be able to buy a coffee mug, a hat, a t-shirt, a keychain, maybe some trading pins, things like that. So there's been little nuances here or there over the course of time, but fundamentally what's being sold in retail hasn't changed much. It sort of stood the test of time because those items are things that people typically use to commemorate. A few things have changed though. What's changed though is not with the company, it's with the consumer, right? So if you think about the essence of what's changed from a consumer perspective, we've all got one of these things, right? So really readily, if I go into a retail shop anywhere, either in a park or resort or in the wild, so to speak, right? All I need to do is pull up this item or scan a barcode on an item. I can look at price, where it was manufactured, what the components of that product are, where those components were sourced, where they sourced in a socially responsible and environmentally responsible way. I mean, you think about the power now that the consumer has, and that transformation has happened probably in the last 10 or so years with the advent of the iPhone in 2007 sort of unlocked the power of the consumer. So that would be one thing. I think the second difference is really a higher expectation of service and quality, or maybe stated a little differently, the value for price paid given the choices that consumers have, right? So they're really keen, and you guys can think about your own shopping experience too. You're really keen on a really good price value relationship, and you stay loyal to brands that provide a good value proposition, and you walk away from brands that don't, right? And so that's been a bit of a transformation. And again, partially born of the education and the information that the consumer has at their fingertips. And then I would say the third thing, and probably the scariest thing to me, is the socialization or democratization of expectations, or I call it FOBC, the fear of being canceled, right, as a company. And that's a real thing. We see it all the time with companies who have maybe taken a risk on a product or an art style or things like that. And for some reason, there's a backlash and they just get canceled. Right. And so that's kind of a real phenomenon that retailers have to be very, very cognizant of, because you never know what's going to cause a firestorm. right? So those three things I would say probably have been the most material changes that I've seen over the arc of my retail career.
Kenny, can you talk about some of those items that, you know, I might walk into a souvenir shop or a retail shop and think I would never pay $300 for that, right? But there's a market for it. So beyond the keychains and the t-shirts and the coffee mugs, there are those high priced, to some people, very high value items that are in the locked glass case, right? Can you talk about the evolution of those and how that has maybe, you know, enhance the experience of people being able to take away a bigger piece of that experience that they had at the park?
Yeah, sure. That's a good question. So, you know, that was really, I would say, probably in the early 2000s, you know, early to mid 2000s, where again, the consumer was more educated, and retailers just generally, but also parks and resorts retailers, felt like they needed to have something that differentiated them. In other words, something that somebody couldn't buy on Amazon or couldn't go to like a Target or Walmart or whatever and buy, that had a Mickey on it or a Woody Woodpecker, or pick any other IP that you want to think about. So it was, how do you differentiate parks and resorts? And I'll use parks and resorts as the specific example to your question. How do you create something that's differentiated and that would yield a higher ticket price, and that was so sort of out of the norm that it sort of scratched an itch for the consumer, but also it wasn't comparable or comparable, right, to anything that they could find outside, right? So if you think about, we introduced things like Swarovski crystal, right? So you think about those ear hats that had Swarovski crystal on them, $1,200. We knew that there wasn't a market for every consumer to buy those, but if you sold, 40 or 50 a week, that's a nice little niche, and it's largely incremental because that guest was most likely not going to buy a regular ear hat for $9.99. They wanted something different, something unique and special, right? That kind of thing. For the same reason, we introduced things like Dooney and Burke bags. So those co-brands with Swarovski, Dooney and Burke, Kate Spade, all those things that we introduced to the brand were important in that sense because it captured a guest that would otherwise may not have spent as much on basic theme park souvenir items and were likely to spend more from a collections perspective. The second piece I would tell you about that is the whole notion of limited editions was born as a result of this too, right? So even a trading pen, a souvenir trading pen that was like $8.95 at the time, I think they're up to maybe 12 or 13 bucks now, just because of, the price value relationships and the quality of the item. A limited edition strategy on those types of things was huge because it got people into the game, right? It got people into collecting something. And I call it kind of the gift that keeps on giving, right? Once you give them the first pen, and a lot of times we would say, buy a lanyard, get 2 pens for free, one to keep, one to trade. So got them into the trading game and got them into the collecting game as well. And then further, we defined that customers had affinity towards certain characters. And you guys have your own favorite Disney character, right? Mine happens to be Gaston. I love Gaston from Beauty and the Beast. He's boorish. He's an oaf. He's like completely over the top, but he's hilarious, right? So I'm like, I kind of like the guy. So I just collected pens. And so I've got an entire collection of Gaston pens. Well, that's the way consumers were purchasing and consuming those items. So we're like, well, let's just feed the machine, right? So that's how that kind of came about. But it was really born of the notion that how can you create a differentiator for the parks guests relative to what they could buy in any other number of places?
Sure. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And particularly how you talk about kind of those premium items or those limited edition, and making that great point of that you have no intention of selling these to the masses. You're not offering these because there are X amount of millions of guests who are visiting every single year. You're offering because there is a very small percentage of those who are more likely to buy it than others. And with that said, then there are those other, I would say, lower tier or lower price items that are going to be more appealing to the vast demographics. And you kind of jogged my memory a little bit here when When I worked for Disney several years ago, what I remember was I could be sitting at home watching TV, and I could see a commercial come on for Walt Disney World. Obviously, I was living in Orlando, and I would see guests walking around in the commercial with the particular Mickey ears hat on, with the balloon that has the Mickey head inside of it. And then the next day I would go to work and I would see more of those now in the park. So I could see pretty quickly, all right, there's this cross between marketing and retail of being able to get guests to purchase more because they've seen it on TV. And of course, those are the products that are more available for the masses.
Yeah, we call that I always call that the double word score, right? Using Scrabble parlance. I'm like, yes, every time I saw one of those commercials, I'm like, buy more,
right?
Buy more.
Yeah. One of the things too that we've also spoken about in conversations that I think really ties in very nicely, of course, when talking about retail, is you've said that retail is like the gratuity that guests leave when visiting a theme park, and would love to hear your explanation of that and what that means.
Yeah, it is an interesting concept. So when you think about, sort of simply stated, the overall experience at a park and resort in this context, or could be a restaurant in the real world, or a retail store in the real world, or whatever, by the guest is viewed in aggregate, right? So they don't understand our org chart. And sometimes we confuse things and confuse people to think that the way we're structured is the way guests view us, which is not the case, right? So in the parlance of theme parks, the guest doesn't care who runs attractions, and they don't care who runs retail, and they don't care who runs food and beverage. They care that the experience is holistic and is really good, right? So if you think about that, and that the guest views the experience in aggregate, then I'll use the example of a restaurant, right? So if I walked into a restaurant and the person who seated me was rude, they didn't give me a menu when I got seated, they brought water, but they never filled the water glass, the steak that I bought, or the chicken I bought, or fish, or whatever that I ordered off the menu was cold when it came out. They never refilled my glass. They were rude. They dumped my drink in my lap and didn't apologize. Whatever. I mean, we've all had those kinds of
a lot of service failures.
Right? We've all had those experiences. So my question then to people would be, how likely would you be to leave a tip? 0, right? You would be like, well, so a gratuity or the tip, which stands for to ensure promptness, right? That's the definition of tip, right? So if you got none of those things, the likelihood that you would leave a tip is slim and none, right? And Slim probably just left town, right? And so similarly, when you think about the overall experience in a great environment like a theme park or resort, so as hospitality folks, I walked into the resort, everything was clean, or I walked into the theme park, everything was clean and orderly. I was greeted when I came through the gates. My experience in the retail shop or the food and beverage when I got my QSR was great. The attractions, the lines weren't unmanageable because they had enough ride vehicles to do what I needed to do. So that full day experience was amazing, right? And my family was raving about the parade, and right there by the Emporium on Main Street, I'm reflecting as a guest on, God, that was amazing. That was an incredible day. I want to go commemorate that, right? And so the way we think about retail as the gratuity is, if you've had an amazing experience, you're willing then to go buy a tangible reminder. That's a key term, right? A tangible reminder of the visit. So memories are by definition very ethereal, right? But the tangibility of that is if I have a Mickey plush, or in this example, a Masters mug, right? I had an amazing experience at the Masters, start to finish, right? I got to be right next to Tiger Woods or whatever, right? And the experience was amazing. So I wanted to say, you know what? I'm willing to commemorate that experience with the mug that I bought. And that's what guests do with their disposable dollars. And if you think about your dining experience, back to that bad dining experience example, the most disposable of purchases in a restaurant is the gratuity that you leave, right? Because they're probably not going to give you a break on the food. They're not going to give you a break on any, right? But you have a choice whether or not you're going to leave a tip. Similarly, in a theme park experience or a resort experience, you're more likely to leave that tip with the most disposable of your purchases, which happens to be retail, right? Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Mhm.
And it really is, the icing on the cake, right? When you take that home, you've got all these great experiences. And now, I mean, just look around my office behind me, right? All these tangible reminders of all the experiences I've had that I want to put up there because I'm a visual person. I'm an everything out person. So I want to have that out there and be surrounded by that. And, all of your examples so far, the pins, the mug, the t-shirt, whatever it is, that really does help extend the experience for
Absolutely
people
right.
about it. Yeah.
And then the other notion to that too is, I think about the tangible reminder aspect of it. The lifeblood of any park or resort or business in general, if you want to think about that way, or a hotel or a restaurant or whatever, the biggest driver is this notion of intent to return, right? And what does intent to return mean? That means if you had an amazing experience, you're going to tell people about it, but you're going to come back. And when you come back to my restaurant or my retail store, or my park or resort, when you come back, that means I have to market less to people who have never come, right? So ideally, I would say, I'd like to spend nothing on marketing. I'd like you to be my marketing vehicle, right? And so if I can do more of that and make what I call brand deposits, and you saw a posting I did on LinkedIn yesterday around this notion of brand deposits. So if you got the entire team, the entire ecosystem believing that every single thing we do is a brand deposit or a brand withdrawal, and make brand deposits consciously, the guest experience would be so amazing that theoretically everybody would return and you never have to spend a nickel on marketing. And the marketing budgets for parks, resorts, retail stores, restaurants are staggeringly huge because they've not yet figured out the essence that if they can just do better with the customers they have, they don't have to spend all that money, and then they can put that money back into infrastructure, put that money back into improving the guest experience. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And then even with that retail component of it, if I'm wearing that t-shirt out and about, that's a conversation starter right there. So now I've spent money on marketing the business, basically, is what it is. So if retail is the gratuity that people will leave based off of a phenomenal experience, is it safe to say that the revenue and the per cap that the retail department generates is purely dependent on all other departments needing, all other at least front of house departments and many back of house departments firing on all cylinders so that the guest wants to enter the retail shop? Otherwise, you can walk out of a park, even if you had a good experience, without spending a single dollar on a tangible reminder.
Yeah, Joe, I think that's exactly right. And, while you're still going to do retail revenue because people bump into stuff occasionally and go, oh, I've always wanted a Pluto, pencil wrap or whatever, right? And they'll buy it. But generally speaking, I would tell you that there is a high dependency on the overall experience to the level of, I'll give you a great example. When the pandemic was at its height, and I stay in contact with people from Disney, Universal, SeaWorld, Six Flags. I mean, being in the industry as long as I have, just sort of bump into people, right? And people. What we saw was that because the service was so bad, and it wasn't because the people were bad at service, it was because the number of people weren't there to serve, right? In other words, the insufficiency of labor because of the payroll protection and the, I call it the STEMIs, the government STEMIs that people would get. It was difficult for people to make that choice. Like, well, I could either not take this unemployment extra benefit, or I could go back to work for $12 an hour. And they did the math and they go, well, I can make more money sitting at home. Mm-hmm. And so the upshot to that was that theme parks and resorts generally saw a decrease in per capita spending because, number one, they didn't have people to wait on them or serve them. And number two, there was just so many guests relative to the number of people that were trying to serve them that it was such a bad experience that people would walk, right? Mm-hmm. So that was a real dynamic. And fortunately now the labor has stabilized a little bit. Stimulus has sort of dissipated in many states. And now you're seeing people go back to work and that service improve. And therefore you see per cap numbers beginning to climb pretty significantly. And now I will tell you that on a per cap basis or a per occupied room basis or whatever metric they use is kind of the denominator. Most every theme park and resort business and hospitality business now is seeing the highest per cap numbers that they've ever seen, because people had that pent up sort of cash that they had and they wanted to go spend it, but they couldn't leave their house, and now they can. So they're just basically consuming beyond belief. And so it was no different for us at Great Wolf, and all my contacts in the industry have said the same thing. It's just like, man, if we could sustain these numbers, we're going to have a record year, even with some disruption on attendance or disruption on occupancy, right?
Yeah. Kenny, I'm glad you brought up the LinkedIn post about the deposits and withdrawals, because I had a note to ask you a little bit more about that. So since you brought it up, can you maybe go a little deeper into what those brand deposits are and what that might look like for a theme park? What would that mean to them to make more deposits into their brand so that they could, potentially not have to spend that much money on marketing?
Yeah, I appreciate you asking that, because I have a tremendous amount of passion about this. And I know that this represents kind of a cultural wildfire if you can get everybody on the team engaged in this behavior. So what is a brand deposit? What's a brand withdrawal? So the way I think about it is every single interaction with a consumer in your ecosystem, right? Again, it could be an external retailer or a restaurant or a park or resort or whatever, right? We'll take an attraction as an example. So Space Mountain, right? I've got attendance at these attractions, and a brand deposit for an attendant at that attraction at a pre-shift meeting as a leader, what I would say is, okay, today is all about brand deposits. How are we going to make brand deposits? Well, brand deposit is making sure the attraction is up and running. Brand deposit is making sure every car that's available to handle the volume that's predicted is available and ready to go, and that is cycled through. I want to make sure that all my systems and processes are up to speed. I'm going to make sure I have sufficient labor. And then on a real practical guest facing sense, I'm going to pull every attendant in before their shift, and I'm going to go around the room and I'm going to say, okay, today's about brand deposits. Hey, Matt, what are you going to do today as the front door attendant at Space Mountain to make sure we make brand deposits? And Matt, you're going to go, oh, I'm going to call every guest by name. Well, how are you going to know their name? I'm going to ask. Okay. So that's one simple thing that Matt's going to do today is he's going to call guests by name. Hey, what's your name? My name's Sally. Well, Sally, let me tell you about Space Mountain today. It's amazing, right? And so you're making deposit. So everybody in that attraction sort of adopted that same philosophy that they're going to do something differentiated, something as a brand deposit, and that all those other systems and processes were where they needed to be. The experience at Space Mountain that day would be off the charts amazing, right? Mm-hmm. So that's the essence of deposit. And then the converse is withdrawal. So I say that, with brand deposits and brand withdrawals, there is no gray area. Every single thing we do is either one or the other. It's binary. There's no like, it was an okay thing, I'm not going to ding you too bad. Nope, that's a withdrawal. If somebody says, I'm not going to ding you too bad, that's a bad thing. So you always want those things, and you always want your team and your cast members or your employees or your pack, depending on where you live, right, in the world of theme parks and resorts. You want them focused on that consistently. And then you also want to reinforce that behavior and catch people doing something good. I think that's a really important notion. We often as leaders sort of are trained to say, aha, I saw you did something that was out of policy, or you broke a process or whatever. But rarely do you find leaders that say, I saw you doing something good. Hey, Matt, I saw you engaging with Sally today. That was amazing. Now, you may do other things throughout the day that violate a policy or whatever that I have to hold you accountable to. But I mean, just the wind beneath your wings to tell you that, man, you did something good. You made a brand deposit today. And so what I did was effectively, I think I might have shown you guys this the last time, but I created these little challenge coins. Can you see that?
Yep.
Yeah.
So this
So this is from Great Wolf Lodge. Yeah, it says thank you on it. Yeah.
Yeah, this happened to be Great Wolf Lodge, but then on the back, it's basically, there's a little write-up that says, we had one of our core values was we show we care, right? And what this basically says is, you've been caught doing something great. Each opportunity or each interaction with the packer or a guest is an opportunity to make a brand deposit by showing we care. You just did that, and we appreciate you being a role model. And then I signed it, right? So effectively, when I saw these things happen in our ecosystem, I would hand one of these coins out. Now, I will tell you, these coins are like gold. They're not gold, they're brass. But I mean, you would think they were gold, because I had people, when I left the company, send me notes that said, you don't know how huge that was. That sort of unlocked how I think about guest service, or that really helped me, make a decision to stay versus leave, or something simple like that. But it's just really, as a leader, reinforcing that behavior, something tangible, again, that really suggests that I saw you doing something really cool, really good, and I wanted to make sure you knew that I saw you do that.
Yeah. And what I love about the process is that you're tying it back to the brand deposit, right? So it's one thing to say, hey, Kenny, you did a great job, but doing what? And then what does it tie back to? So I love how you finish the circle, if you will.
Totally right. Yeah. There's nothing, I think, less impactful than an ambiguous compliment, right? Like, great job. What do you
what? Yeah. So with those brand deposits, of course, there needs to be a disproportionate amount of deposits compared to withdrawal to have a successful, ecosystem or culture or guest experience. What would be an example of those withdrawals? Because withdrawals, I imagine, are also necessary as well once you've made all these deposits to be able to justify, going to the ATM and withdrawing.
Yeah. So, I always harken back to Chili's restaurant like years ago, and they've subsequently changed it probably 3 or 4 times since then. But I loved their mission statement. And their mission statement was very simple: hot food hot, cold food cold, clean restrooms, money to the bank. That was it, right? And so you think antithetically to those things, like, what's the opposite of hot food hot? It's hot food cold, or cold food hot, or dirty restrooms, or you're not taking money to the bank, right? So all those things would be considered like negative to the brand. And so I use that as an illustration because it's really that simple, right? So if you think about really coaching your teams in pre-shift meetings, I always focus on the brand deposit side, but I also say, are there withdrawals that are going to happen today, right? Are there naturally things that we're going to have to recover against? So you think about a resort that hypothetically has a water park attached to it, and I don't know of any that I've ever heard of, but let's use that as an example. If there's going to be 4 of 5 water slides down today, I should be able to communicate that to my team and say, look, this is going to be a general withdrawal, or there's not going to be, in a traditional theme park perspective, Space Mountain, Splash Mountain, whatever, are going to be closed today because of some safety concerns. Okay, well, there's going to be some withdrawals because there's going to be some guests that are pretty ticked off that they paid $129 for the day, and they're not going to have a fulsome experience. So what that does is basically says to the team, now we're going to have to overdo deposits, right? We're going to have to really overwhelm the guests with deposits, even to the extent that if recovery means that, we're going to give you a free hot dog at Casey's, or we're going to give you, a free pin trading lanyard, which, by the way, we did before and worked very well because it got them in the ecosystem, right? So even though we had to give that first one away, we got them in the game and they bought more down the line. So it wasn't that big a deal in the great scheme of things. But yeah, so that's how I'd answer that question, is that there's going to be inherent withdrawals that are going to happen in sort of the environment that you live in, but you got to coach the team that is what's going to happen today. And there's going to be some guests that are going to, comment about that. And there's going to be some guests that might even get in your face. And here's how to go handle that.
Now, could there be brand withdrawals that are intentional and maybe aren't necessarily based on service failures? So if you put in all these brand deposits of here's that greeter in front of Space Mountain who's learning every single guest's name and providing that phenomenal experience, and that's, you know, one employee or one cast member out of many who are doing their personal brand deposits, inviting the guest into the gift shop after that, could that be considered an intentional brand withdrawal? Now, this is something that we're asking you to do, and you're going to be more likely to do it because we've made all these deposits. You had a phenomenal experience. Please leave us an online review. Or even from a leadership standpoint of asking an employee to come in on their day off or working later to say, well, we're going to make all these deposits from the employee engagement leadership side of it in the event that we might need to make a withdrawal later in the future.
So give me an example of the withdrawal again.
If you asking a guest for a positive online review, if they had a phenomenal experience, so you've made all those deposits of guaranteeing that, and now at the end of that, you're requesting positive public feedback in exchange for the experience that you just provided and the overwhelming disproportional amount of deposits that you put in there.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, my perspective has always been on that if you get anything other than organic feedback, it feels forced and it feels like a withdrawal, right? And feedback in the form of a guest survey, if you sort of, you know, I bought a car recently and the salesman says, okay, I need all 10s or I'm not going to get my bonus this month. And I'm like, I'm not going to be compelled to give you 10s if I don't think you were 10, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and so your point is well taken, but if it's organic, in other words, that, hey, there's an opportunity to take a survey, here's the link. You're not telling them what you want. You're just telling them that there's a survey, and it keeps in the top of their mind. Well, you know what? I do want to give good feedback, not I'm asking for good feedback. And the same thing in retail stores. I always tell people in the retail context that there's hot lava behind the POS counters, right? It's hot lava. You don't stand there. There's not a barrier between you and the guest. You need to stand at the threshold or the lease line of the store and what I call merchantain. It's one of those Disney hybrid words, right? So merchantain, you're bouncing a ball, you're playing with a puppet, you're doing whatever to engage the guests to come in. You're not saying, hey, you had a great experience today. Come on in and buy some product from us, right? Normally, you don't have to do that. So yeah, I could see I could see that if that were happening, that would certainly feel like a negative.
Yeah. So Kenny, obviously you're very passionate about the deposits and withdrawals, but I also know that you're passionate about developing your team members and developing other leaders. So can you talk a little bit about how you've gone about doing that over your career, and maybe even some advice that you might have for people that are kind of navigating their way through the through the ranks of leadership?
Yeah, so I would say that, you know, in short, I've always said that leadership is a customized exercise as opposed to a commoditized exercise. So the most success that I've ever had as a leader is when I've taken a one size fits one approach as opposed to a one size fits all approach, right? I think of a great story, and I use this example a fair bit with leaders who I'm kind of coaching and trying to develop. A lot of young leaders read great leadership books, and there's a tremendous number of great leadership books out there. Don't get me wrong, but I think they sort of get lost in this morass of, you know, how can I lead the entire team at the same time? And you can't effectively do that. You have to lead individuals. Individuals comprise the team. So there's a great story that I often impart to these folks. And it's the story of a man who's, you know, out on the beach in LA. He's at a business trip and he decides he needs to go out and get some fresh air. So he's walking down the beach, and down the beach, he sees what looks like somebody throwing things into the ocean. And as he gets closer, he looks around the beach and there's thousands of starfish laying around throughout the beach. He gets a little closer and he sees this young boy who's picking up these starfish and throwing them into the ocean one by one. And he asks the kid, "What are you doing?" The kid says, "I'm saving the starfish." And the guy says, "Well, there's literally millions here. You can't hope to possibly be making a difference." And the kid, as he throws one more in, says, "I made a difference for that one." Now, that's a really silly little story, But if you think about it from a leadership perspective, that's the essence of really good leaders, right? Is they take time to make a difference for that one, that single starfish or that single person. And it accentuates how I think I want to be remembered as a leader, that I helped that one, right? So without thinking of each person as a unique entity, I think you're going to be way less able to be an effective leader. Does that make sense?
100%.
Yeah. You've also talked about the philosophy that you have of using your heart, your head, and your hands as part of your leadership philosophy or your leadership mindset. Can you walk us through that balance and how that makes someone a stronger leader by kind of navigating each of those three?
Sure. Yeah. So I think, simply stated, I think finding the equilibrium between those three different aspects of who we are as leaders is probably the biggest ongoing challenge that most leaders have. So a lot of leaders will say, well, it's a third, a third, a third. And so what does head, heart, and hands mean? Head is sort of the strategic side of things. Heart is sort of the human or people side of things, and hands is sort of the tactical or executional side of things. And when people try to say, I'm going to handle every situation with equilibrium, a third, a third, a third, they're going to fail immutably, right? So circumstantially, there are times when one has to rise up and rise over the top and kind of take over. So could be counseling a team member who's going through maybe a real life challenge outside of work, right? So that would be a time when the heart has to be supreme and the head and the hands sort of are subordinated in that sense, right? Could be customer issue that requires maybe some innovative problem solving. That's where the head and the strategy comes into play, right? And sort of superimposes itself over the heart and the hands, right? Could be rolling up your sleeves when there isn't enough labor to manage or run an operation, which we've all experienced over the past year and a half, right? So that's where the hands have to come in and say, hey, the strategy's built, we got the humans to a degree, but I got to go in and I got to do the doing for now, right? And so that, again, the head is the problem solving kind of strategic aspect of things. The heart is the human side, and the hands are really the tactical side. And I would say that the very best leaders that I have seen and those that I try to emulate are as adept in each one of those things as they are all the others. And they dynamically shift between them as circumstances arise. And as a result, they're viewed as kind of stabilizing or kind of a rock in a storm, if you will, as opposed to being sort of a victim of circumstance, or I guess stated differently, kind of lending to the chaos, or maybe even creating a little chaos. So certainly aspirational, but that's kind of how I think about it is how can I dynamically shift between those things and be kind of available in every aspect of that sort of spectrum. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think connecting the dots to what you said earlier about, one size fits one, there are people that you may have to be more conscious of the head, heart, and hands, not just circumstances, but even people where you have to adjust the balance of that three-legged stool, if you will.
Totally right. And I think you're 100% right. If you understand that the notion that every person is unique and differentiated, and that they're not a commodity, they're really a custom character, or a snowflake, if you will, then you're better able to give them challenges to motivate them. You're better able to give them projects that meet the needs that they have. And then, what happens has been my experience in observing great leaders is, the leadership scores for people like that are off the charts. They are just exponentially greater than other leaders who are pretty good at one of the three things, or maybe two of the three. That's a big deal, right? Not that we're in it for scores, but scores indicate people's sentiment, and sentiment about leaders is a big opportunity.
Yeah. One kind of follow-up I have to that is, one trend that I've seen in many of the organizations I've worked with is kind of this concept of we have to do more with less, meaning that one leader that had 10 people, now we're going to synergize those teams, and now one leader has 20 people. And you get to the point where that same leader now has 100 people. And you can't at least it seems like you can't do the one-on-one type of leadership anymore. So what is your advice or thoughts to organizations that have gotten to that place of the ratio is way out of whack? How do you get them back to the right ratio, even though they're saying, hey, we're spending less on our leadership payroll?
Mm-hmm. Well, I developed a sort of a core leadership tool back right after 9/11. And the foundation of it was, 9/11 happened, and we all remember kind of the visceral impact that had on us. My dad, 1 month to the day later, which is coming up here in a couple of weeks, fell out of a chair of a heart attack. And it sort of created kind of this existential crisis for me. And I was like, am I doing what I should be doing as a leader? Am I fulfilling my purpose generally? And so I developed a curriculum called AIM, AIM, Aspiration, Inspiration, Motivation. And so the essence of it is helping people identify what drives them or motivates them, which is the flame that burns within each of us. And again, to use the sort of Disney or Pooh parlance, we all know people in our lives that are Eeyores, and we know people that are Tiggers, right? And so, you think about anywhere on that spectrum in between. So helping people understand what drives them to do what they do, and then understanding that as a leader, so I can provide projects and or disciplines that are appropriate for that person to feed that fire, is a big deal. The second aspect of that is inspiration. So what inspires your team? And I always ask people, when did your fire burn the brightest? As a leader, that's important to know, because you want to understand how you can make people's fire burn bright all the time. If you got a bunch of bright fires burning on your team, you have a high functioning team. And then finally, aspiration. Aspiration is what you want to be, not what you want to do. Aspirations have no finish line. So you get really the essence of the aspirations that people have. I want to be viewed as the most competent person on the team. Okay, that's a good aspiration. I can then, as a leader, help hold you accountable when I see behaviors that are counterintuitive to that. So that simple exercise, AIM, throughout the team. So I do it with my direct reports, and they do it with their reports, and they do it with their reports. Effectively, then it sort of permeates the entire team. And as a result, everybody is given projects and or challenges that are aligned with what they want to do and what motivates them. Everyone is inspired as an individual, like one size fits one, again, not one size fits all. And then everyone is in tune with other people's aspirations and can help hold the individuals and thereby the team accountable. So that's how I've kind of said, regardless of the size of the team that I have, to answer your question, Matt, regardless of the size of the team, I don't think about leading that team any differently. And I think that's what the best leaders do, is they don't shift based on the number, they shift based on how do they get that sort of notion or their leadership philosophy permeated throughout their organization.
Cool.
Excellent. Kenny, this has been so interesting, a phenomenal conversation. We really appreciate your time, and we're starting to run close to the end here, but curious if you have any final thoughts or words of wisdom for our audience out there.
Yeah, we talked a little bit last time about, kind of the future of retail. And so I don't know, maybe for the benefit of the audience, because there'd be a lot of folks listening that I think are in a retail role in some form or fashion in theme parks, resorts, or hospitality. And I would tell them maybe to watch out for a few things, or maybe take advantage of a few things. So number one, convenience. Convenience is a value added service to consumers. So to the extent you possibly can, let convenience be a differentiator. The best of breed retailers out there have figured out that convenience means that customers are willing to pay a premium. And we think about our own shopping experiences, and that's true. Think also about differentiation in a sea of sameness, right? We talked a little bit about that earlier on limited edition strategies, things like that. But companies have also begun to increasingly develop proprietary products that aren't comparable in the market. And what that does is it gives a price value advantage to the companies that are doing that. The third thing I would say is probably a notion that I call fish where the fish are. this notion of if you build it, they will come, I think has gone by the wayside. So these big brick and mortar locations are giving way now. If you think about malls out there going dark, but parking lots in malls filled with food trucks and or, retail stands are popping up everywhere. So embrace the notion that, you can fish where the fish are. It's going to require a little bit of capital and a little bit of thinking differently, but how do you take your products to consumers where they are versus expecting them to come to you? It goes back a little bit to that convenience. Responsible sourcing is going to be ever more important. So for all of you out there that are looking at sourcing products, make sure you understand the chain of custody of raw materials all the way through your supply chain, because again, customers are more and more adept at understanding where you sourced your products. And that's a big sort of fear of being canceled issue too. So just be very careful there. And then finally, I think we're coming out of a labor quality and sufficiency era out of COVID, but think about automation and how you can sort of deploy automation to your advantage without taking the customer experience away. So I wanted to make sure that, just from a pure retailer at heart perspective, that I shared those things and kind of where I see the future of theme parks and resorts and just general retail might be headed, and food for thought for those folks.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing that, Kenny. We're so glad that you got that in. And like Josh said, this has been a fascinating conversation. So if people wanted to learn more about you or get in touch with you, where would you send them?
So Magic Makers Group is probably the best single source. So magicmakersgroup.com. I would challenge you guys that if you have any needs in any aspect of a business or any consulting needs on how to, create some operational efficiencies or really kind of close the gap between a brand promise and operational excellence. That's the essence of what we'd be doing. Again, 500 plus years of experience with it was a pretty good company, right?
Just a small little company.
Yeah, who knows how to serve guests and is world class in a lot of different things. I mean, to have this group of people together to really help, I think is a huge opportunity for companies that are maybe smaller or, trying to hit that sort of next echelon of growth. Little time with the Magic Makers, I think you'd be sort of well advised to give us a call. So magicmakersgroup.com, and, happy to help in any way we can. So thank you for letting me plug that once again.
Of course.
Absolutely. Kenny, thank you again so much for your time today. Of course, we absolutely appreciate the opportunity to chat with you. And as we wind this down, for everyone out there who's watching and listening, just remember, we are all attraction pros.
Thanks for listening to the Attraction Pros podcast.
Make sure to subscribe so you can tune in when new episodes release. And even better, please leave us a review on iTunes.
For more information, visit attractionpros.com.